In the summer of 1851, mechanics from a tiny Vermont village walked into the Crystal Palace in London, laid 6 rifles on a table in front of the British Empire, took them apart, shuffled the pieces, and rebuilt 6 working guns from the mix. British engineers had never seen anything like it. Within 5 years, the company was bankrupt. But that was only the first act. Out of the wreckage grew a firm that would bet everything on a second choice hire, and that bet would change how the world builds machines. This is the story of Jones and Lamson. Quick favor before we start. Hit like and subscribe to Trade Archive. Now, to a brick building beside a brook in Windsor, Vermont. Windsor in the 1840s was a river town of a few thousand people, and its most interesting business was inside the state prison, where a gunmaker named Nicanor Kendall ran a workshop using convict labor. Around 1838, a young mechanic named Richard Lawrence drifted into town from upstate New York and hired on with Kendall for somewhere between $100 and $200 a year. Lawrence had a gift for machinery that bordered on unsettling, and by 1843, the 2 men had left the prison behind and leased their own shop on Mill Brook. They fixed guns. They built rifles one at a time, the way everyone did, with files and patience. And they might have stayed small forever, except that in the winter of 1844, a local businessman named Samuel Robbins walked in with news. Robbins had made his money in timber, and he had heard that the federal government wanted 10,000 rifles for a coming war with Mexico. He offered to put up the capital if Kendall and Lawrence would put up the skill. On February 18, 1845, the partners signed a federal contract for 10,000 Model 1841 rifles. The weapons soldiers would nickname the Mississippi rifle, at $11.90 each. Experienced armorers thought the price was suicide. A hand-built rifle took a skilled man days of filing, fitting, and adjusting, and no 2 came out alike. But Robbins and Lawrence had no intention of building rifles by hand. They built machines instead. Precision milling machines that carved lock parts to shape. Drill presses and fixtures that held every workpiece in exactly the same position, cut after cut. And behind all of it, a system of hardened steel gauges, so that every trigger, every hammer, every screw was checked against a master standard before it left the bench. If a part passed the gauge, it fit any rifle in the batch. No filing, no fitting. This was armory practice, the method the federal armories at Springfield and Harper's Ferry had been developing for decades, and the Windsor men pushed it further than almost anyone alive. In 1846, they raised a 4-story brick armory beside Mill Brook, a building that is still standing today, and then they did something almost nobody did with a government contract. They finished it 18 months early. The Army handed them a second order for 15,000 more rifles. Inside that brick building, the superintendent Frederick Howe and a machinist named Henry Stone developed an early turret lathe, a machine that held multiple cutting tools in a rotating head so one operator could perform a whole sequence of operations without resetting anything. Remember that machine, because a version of it is going to carry this entire story. Historians would later trace a family tree of American manufacturing straight out of this one shop, branches that led to Sharp's rifle, Providence tool, and the measuring instrument giant Brown & Sharp. The mechanics of Windsor were not just building guns. They were building the people and the machines that would build everything else. Which brings us back to London. At the Great Exhibition of 1851, inside the glass and iron halls of the Crystal Palace, Robbins and Lawrence showed 6 of their Mississippi rifles with fully interchangeable parts and walked away with a medal. For the British, this was a quiet humiliation. The greatest manufacturing power on earth had just watched a village firm from Vermont do something its own gun trade could not. So the British did the practical thing. In 1854, they ordered roughly 150 machine tools from Robbins and Lawrence to equip their new government armory at Enfield, the first large-scale export of American machine tools in history. The student had just sold the teacher the classroom. Then came the contract that should have made them rich. In February 1855, with the Crimean War burning through British rifle stocks, the firm of Fox, Henderson and Company engaged Robbins and Lawrence to build 25,000 pattern 1853 Enfield rifle muskets. The partners looked at that number and saw only the beginning. Follow-up orders of 30,000 to 60,000 rifles seemed certain, so they borrowed heavily, expanded the Windsor works, and built an entirely new factory in Hartford, Connecticut. The war did not keep going. Production hit trouble almost immediately. The sample rifles Britain sent over for gauge making turned out to have the wrong dimensions, and the first installment shipped about 6 months late. Then, on March 30th, 1856, diplomats in Paris signed the treaty that ended the Crimean War, and the British government cancelled the contract with penalties attached. Robbins and Lawrence had delivered only around 10,400 rifles, and the British graded them second class. In October 1856, the pioneers of interchangeable manufacturing declared bankruptcy. Their creditors formed the Vermont Arms Company, assembled about 5,600 more Enfields from leftover parts, and failed anyway. The Hartford factory passed to the Sharps Rifle Manufacturing Company. The men who taught the world mass production lost their company to a peace treaty. But the brick armory on Mill Brook refused to die. In 1858, a Massachusetts cutlery firm called Lamson, Goodnow and Yale bought the building at auction and turned it to sewing machines. The Lamson in that name was Ebenezer Lamson, born in Sterling, Massachusetts in 1814, a hard-driving businessman and a committed abolitionist, and when the Civil War came, his politics and his factory pointed the same direction. Lamson secured a federal contract for 50,000 special model 1861 rifle muskets and ran the Windsor works around the clock with more than 300 men. And here is the detail that matters more than the rifles. Lamson's real trade was the machinery itself, sold to Colt, Remington, Sharps, Providence Tool, and the Springfield Armory. One museum curator has estimated that as many as a third of all Model 1861 rifle muskets made for the Union were produced in factories running Windsor-built machines. One small Vermont shop arming the arsenals of the North. When the war ended, the gun business evaporated, and the company began its long shapeshift. It became E.G. Lamson and Company in 1864. A firm that delivered 1,000 Palmer and 1,000 ball breech-loading carbines to the Army in mid-1865, arriving just in time for the war to be over, then the Windsor Manufacturing Company in 1865, and by 1870, Lamson had sold his gun-making machinery to Winchester and Smith & Wesson. In 1868, a textile manufacturer named Russell Jones moved his operations to the area, and the next year the business reorganized as Jones, Lamson and Company, running cotton textiles and machine building under one roof. The owners soon discovered that cotton and machine tools were terrible business partners, so by the late 1870s, the machine side was spun out under its own name, the Jones and Lamson Machine Company. It should have been a fresh start. Instead, the 1880s brought failed investments and draining lawsuits, and by 1888, the company was gasping. The rescue came from 20 miles down the river. A group of investors in Springfield, Vermont, led by Adna Brown, the general manager of the Parks and Woolson Woolen Machinery Works, and including Amasa Woolson, bought the struggling firm and moved the whole operation south to Springfield, taking advantage of an 1884 Vermont law that let towns exempt new industry from taxes for up to 10 years. Now they needed someone to run the shop. Their first choice took one look at remote little Springfield and turned the job down. So on April 1st, 1889, they settled for their second choice, a 27-year-old machinist from Massachusetts. It would turn out to be the most profitable rejection in Vermont history. His name was James Hartness. Born September 3, 1861 in Schenectady, New York, raised in Cleveland where his father worked as a machine shop foreman, Hartness had gone into a screwworks apprenticeship at 16 instead of finishing school. He worked his way through shops in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, including a stint at Pratt & Whitney, teaching himself engineering at the bench. Along the way, he married Lena Pond in 1885 and had 2 daughters, one of whom is going to matter enormously later in this story. He arrived in Springfield with a 3-year contract and a conviction that made his new employers furious. Jones and Lamson built a scattered catalog of machines, and Hartness demanded they kill nearly all of it and stake the entire company on a single product, the turret lathe. To understand why, picture the standard turret lathe of 1889. The turret was a tall cylinder, like a drum standing on end, with the cutting tools mounted in holes bored around its sides. It worked, but it had a built-in flaw. The workpiece could never pass over the turret, so the machine could only handle short parts, and the cramped tool stations left no room for elaborate setups. Hartness had been sketching a way around this for years. His answer was almost insultingly simple: flatten the drum. In the Hartness flat turret lathe, patented and first sold in 1891, the turret became a low disc about 16 inches across, lying flat on a carriage that slid along the bed like an ordinary engine lathe. Tools bolted to its top surface, and because the turret now sat low, the workpiece could extend right out over it, which meant the machine could turn and thread parts far longer than anything the old drum design could touch. The wide, flat surface gave setup men room to mount complicated slides and multiple tool holders, and the whole assembly was rigid in a way competitors could not match. When the veteran machine tool builder Ambrose Swayze saw the design, he reportedly predicted the industry would be hearing more from young Hartness and from this lazy Susan of his. He was right in ways he could not have imagined. The flat turret lathe made older machines look obsolete, and orders poured in from the industries then being born: automobiles, agricultural machinery, electrical equipment. Understand what this machine meant on a factory floor. A skilled setup man could arrange an entire sequence of cuts on that flat disc, and then a far less experienced operator could run the machine all day, part after identical part. Hartness had not just built a better lathe, he had bottled skill itself, and every growing industry in America wanted to buy it. The trade press noticed fast. American Machinist gave the design a substantial write-up in May of 1891, and the company kept building on the idea, a heavier model in 1903 and a double spindle version around 1912. For nearly a decade, Jones and Lamson sold this one machine and nothing else, and a later company catalog claimed more than 14,000 had been built and sold. Hartness had negotiated a royalty on every lathe, and the money made him a legend, though the accounts disagree on the numbers. One version says $100 per machine. Another says $1,000 a year, plus a $100 bonus per lathe. Local lore inflated it to $1,000 a day. Whatever the true figure, it bought him a controlling interest in the company. He became manager in 1896 and president in 1901, and Jones and Lamson became, in every way that mattered, his instrument. Now, how do you actually build a precision machine in the 1890s, in a town without a single traffic light? You start with iron. The great beds and frames of these lathes were poured as sand castings, massive gray iron shapes that had to rest and season, so internal stresses would not warp them later. Then came the part no machine could do. The sliding surfaces, the V-shaped ways the carriage rode on, were finished by hand scraping, a craftsman working a steel scraper over the surface, checking it against a master plate smeared with marking blue, shaving off high spots a few 10,000ths of an inch at a time. The company's own manual boasted that the turret was scraped to its seat on the carriage and locked down with an annular jib to take up wear. Every accurate machine was born from a more accurate hand, guided by gauges, in a chain of precision that ran straight back to the gun gauges of the Windsor Armory. Jones and Lamson even kept a related foundry business, Vermont Foundries, feeding iron to the machine shops. In Springfield, precision was not a slogan, it was a supply chain. And here, Hartness did something that would get a modern executive fired. When his best engineers invented things, he did not lock them down with contracts. He funded them and let them leave. In 1896, he backed his own engineer Edwin Fellows to launch a gear shaper company in Springfield, right as the automobile was about to make quiet, precise gears one of the most valuable products on Earth. What became of that company is a story big enough to deserve its own telling. Then it happened again. William Bryant joined Jones and Lamson as a draftsman in 1897, rose to chief engineer, and developed an advanced chucking grinder for finishing hardened parts. In March 1909, with Hartness's support, he founded the Bryant Chucking Grinder Company. Within a year, Bryant grinders were running in Ford and Cadillac plants, and during the First World War, over 100 of them ground parts for the Liberty aircraft engine. Add Fred Lovejoy's tool company in 1916, a firm still operating in Springfield today. Add George Gridley, who went on to design automatics for National Acme. Add other Hartness protégés scattering into the industry. And this stretch of the Black River Valley filled with more than 50 machine tool firms, until this rural corner of Vermont enjoyed the highest per capita income in the state. One man's generosity had built an entire industrial ecosystem, but the man himself was already staring past the shop floor at the sky. Hartness was rich now, and his obsessions ran in strange directions. In 1903, he built a mansion on a hill above Springfield, and in 1910, he installed something on the front lawn that no neighbor had ever seen. A turret telescope of his own design, patented in 1912, where the observer sat inside a rotating dome, warm through the brutal Vermont winters while the optics tracked the stars outside. From the mansion's basement, a 240-foot underground tunnel ran out to the telescope, past his private underground workshop, library, and study, a hidden kingdom beneath the lawn. In his 50s, he became one of the first licensed airplane pilots in the country, founded the Vermont Aero Club, and donated the land for Vermont's first airport, where Charles Lindbergh would land the year after his Atlantic flight. Hartness would eventually hold roughly 120 patents, and in 1920, the voters of Vermont elected the Machinist governor. He served one term, from 1921 to 1923, campaigning on industry, roads, and aviation. Not bad for the second-choice hire. While Hartness rose, another figure had quietly entered the story. In 1912, Jones and Lamson bought a small Philadelphia firm, the Fay Machine Tool Company, for its automatic lathe design. The man assigned to perfect it was a young engineer named Ralph Flanders, and his path to Springfield ran through a wedding. Flanders was born September 28, 1880, in Barnet, Vermont, raised on subsistence farms and in Rhode Island mill towns, too poor for college, so he apprenticed as a machinist and draftsman, and later spent 5 years in New York editing a machine tool magazine. In 1911, he married Helen Hartness, the boss's daughter, and joined the family firm. Together with his brother Ernest, Flanders turned the Fay Automatic Lathe into a production weapon. A drum studded with cams and dogs made exactly 1 revolution per cycle, automatically advancing the cutting tools through a complete sequence while a rear toolbar faced the part at the same time. The operator loaded a workpiece, engaged the machine, and simply walked away. For Detroit, cranking out steering knuckles and transmission gears by the hundreds of thousands, this was money printed in cast iron. And the historian Joseph Rowe later wrote that the Fay did for the ordinary lathe what earlier automatics had done for the turret lathe. Then, the First World War exposed a crisis hiding inside every machine in America. Screw threads made by different contractors did not match. A nut from one factory would not fit a bolt from another, and in wartime, that meant jammed guns and stranded equipment. Washington created the National Screw Thread Commission to standardize the country's threads and put Hartness in the chair. Standards were one thing. Inspection was the nightmare. Checking a thread mechanically was slow, subjective, and easy to get wrong. Hartness, the amateur astronomer, had a different idea. What if you could see the thread, blown up huge, projected as a shadow? To build it, he reached for the strangest resume in Springfield. Russell Porter was a hometown boy, born in Springfield in 1871, who had studied art and architecture at MIT until a lecture by the polar explorer Robert Peary infected him with what he called Arctic fever. Porter spent more than a decade on roughly 6 Arctic expeditions, and on one of them, his ship, the steam yacht America, was crushed by pack ice at Teplitz Bay, stranding the party in the polar darkness for about 2 years. He came home broke, painted, taut, and ground telescope mirrors, and in 1913, Hartness had mailed him 2 16-inch glass blanks like a fisherman baiting a hook. In 1919, Porter finally moved back to Springfield and onto the Jones and Lamson payroll. That year, working with Hartness and the Yale optics professor Charles Hastings, Porter helped create the first commercial optical comparator. A calibrated light source threw parallel rays across the part being inspected, and lenses and mirrors projected its silhouette, magnified up to 200 times, onto a screen printed with a template chart. If the shadow of a screw thread strayed from the lines by a hair's width, the part failed. An inspection that had taken tedious minutes of skilled gauging now took seconds on a workbench under ordinary shop light. The patent, filed in 1925 and granted in 1929, protected a product line so durable that versions of it are still being built in Springfield today. Astronomy had just paid for itself on the factory floor, and the astronomy did not stop there. In August 1920, Porter started an evening class teaching telescope making. 15 students, 14 of them Jones and Lamson machinists, plus 1 school teacher, grinding their own mirrors after shifts. In December 1923, they formally organized as the Springfield Telescope Makers, and on Breezy Hill above town, they built a little pink clubhouse they named Stella Fane, meaning Shrine to the Stars. Their first convention in 1926 drew amateur astronomers from across the country, and articles in Scientific American turned a Vermont hobby club into the birthplace of amateur telescope making in America. Porter himself was recruited in 1928 to help design the 200-inch Hale telescope at Palomar Observatory in California, where his legendary cutaway drawings guided the largest telescope on Earth. When the Second World War came, the Navy put those same drafting hands to work on cutaway drawings of weapons and on artillery sites. He died in Pasadena in 1949. Hartness, his patron, spent his final years in failing health, went through 3 operations in 1925, and still filed roughly 10 patents on precision thread gauging in the last 3 years of his life. He died in 1934, a machinist who ended his life as an ex-governor with a telescope on his lawn. The company now belonged to Ralph Flanders. Flanders took the presidency in 1933, in the pit of the Great Depression, when some 400 Vermont manufacturers went under. Jones and Lamson survived on the strength of its machines and, of all things, export orders from the Soviet Union. But the real transformation was coming from Europe, and it arrived with engines overhead. When the Second World War ignited, the machine tools of Springfield suddenly became some of the most strategically important objects in America, because every rifle, every aircraft engine, every tank began its life on a machine like a Jones and Lamson lathe. By late 1940, the Springfield plant was running 7 days a week, 23 hours a day, with 1 hour held back for maintenance. Jones and Lamson, Fellows and Bryant together employed 5,400 workers, climbing to 7,450 by the end of 1942, and J&L alone multiplied its production 6 times over between 1939 and 1942. Of the roughly 300,000 machine tools American industry delivered to the war effort in 1941 and 1942, about 30,000 came out of this one small Vermont town. Jones and Lamson alone took on around 1,600 new hires for war production, inside a plant that had grown to 270,000 square feet sprawled across 12 acres beside the river. Springfield's population exploded from 8,000 to 22,000, boarding houses overflowed, and the little town on the Black River became, pound for pound, one of the most productive war factories on the planet. The boom also pulled in workers the industry had never welcomed before. At one neighboring Springfield plant, the wartime workforce swelled to around 3,300 people, and roughly 400 of them were women, running precision machinery in a trade that had been an all-male fraternity for a century. But wartime demand came with a cliff edge nobody could see. In 1943, the government announced it had enough machine tools, and the orders simply stopped. Springfield's population fell back toward 8,000 almost as fast as it had risen. Boarding houses emptied out, and the men and women still holding jobs looked at their paychecks, then at the fortunes the war had built in the front offices, and started asking hard questions. The war made the companies rich. The people running the machines saw less of it. As hours were cut, organizers from the United Electrical Workers Union arrived in Springfield, and workers began signing cards by the hundreds. Local 218 won bargaining rights at Jones and Lamson, and what followed was decades of grinding conflict, grievances, arbitration fights over wildcat strikes, job classifications, and staffing. The numbers tell you why the anger never faded. By 1968, the average wage at Jones and Lamson was $3.68 an hour. The postcard version of Springfield showed brilliant inventors and gleaming machines. The shop floor version was a quarter-century of work traded for pocket change in old age, and the bitterness from those years never really left town. Flanders, meanwhile, had left the shop floor for a much bigger stage. After running the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and serving on the War Production Board, he was elected to the United States Senate from Vermont in 1946. He was sworn in just 4 days after the election to fill a vacant seat, a technicality that handed him 2 months of seniority over every other freshman in his class. And there, in 1954, this machinist turned senator picked a fight nobody in Washington wanted. Senator Joseph McCarthy was at the peak of his red-baiting power, wrecking careers with accusations and intimidating both parties into silence. Flanders was disgusted, and by his own account, the conviction grew in him that something had to be done, even if I had to do it myself. On March 9, 1954, he stood on the Senate floor and mocked McCarthy's crusade while other senators studied their shoes. McCarthy did not even bother to show up for it. In June, he moved to strip McCarthy of his chairmanships and was blocked. So on July 30, 1954, Flanders introduced a resolution of censure, charging that McCarthy's conduct was contrary to senatorial traditions. A select committee took up the charges, and on December 2, 1954, the Senate condemned McCarthy by a vote of 67 to 22. The Republicans split exactly down the middle, and McCarthy's reign of fear was effectively over. The man who broke him had learned his nerve in a Vermont machine shop. Flanders retired from the Senate in 1959 and died in 1970. And with him went the last of the giants. What happened next is the part of the story America kept repeating in town after town. In 1964, Jones and Lamson was acquired by Textron, the Providence-based conglomerate, and folded into its Waterbury-Farrell division. The company that had always been run by machinists who lived up the hill was now a line item managed from another state. One credit rating study later estimated that from 1968 to 1976, absentee corporate parents like Textron were responsible for more than half the manufacturing jobs New England lost to plant closings. Springfield was about to become a statistic in that ledger. To be fair to Textron, the early years brought some modernization money, and the machines kept shipping. But the decisions that mattered were no longer being made by people who could hear the shop floor from their office window. The technology was turning too. Numerical control, and then computer numerical control, was transforming the lathe from a mechanical machine into a computerized one, and it demanded heavy investment and fast adaptation. Jones and Lamson actually built a CNC lathe line good enough to become an industry standard. But the execution around it failed. A local historian who worked those years recalled that the company refused to put anything but American-made controls on its machines, even as customers found Japanese controls easier to program. And Japan was coming, delivering standardized, cheaper machines in weeks, while American builders worked through fat order backlogs one machine at a time and made buyers wait a year or more. When the recession of the early 1980s hit and half the new lathes sold in America were suddenly foreign, the outcome stopped being a question. Jones and Lamson's Springfield workforce collapsed from nearly 1,200 to fewer than 250 in 3 years. Then came the dismemberment. In 1980, Textron ripped the profitable optical comparator division, J&L Metrology, out of Vermont and moved it to South Carolina, leaving about 70 skilled workers behind. The move flopped, and a neighboring Springfield firm eventually bought the division and brought it home. In 1983, Textron announced it was shifting manufacturing to Connecticut and to Belgium, cutting Springfield to a skeleton assembly crew. In 1985, Textron washed its hands entirely, selling the operation to an investor group led by a California businessman named Donald Hoods. 14 months later, in November 1986, Jones and Lamson filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and most of its assets were liquidated. A financial group picked over the remains in 1988, merged what was left into the Fellows Corporation in 1990. And when that parent company itself went bankrupt in February 2002, roughly 790,000 square feet of Springfield manufacturing space went dark for good. The Great Factory on Clinton Street, 270,000 square feet of brick beside the Black River, sat unheated and unguarded, and scavengers stripped its electrical systems for salvage. The local development corporation eventually bought the ruin out of bankruptcy for $165,000, only to find the ground soaked with PCBs and industrial solvents, and it took a $3.7 million state cleanup award before demolition could even begin. A building that had armed the Allies through 2 world wars was worth less than a suburban house. And yet, if you know where to look, Jones and Lamson never entirely died. In Rockford, Illinois, a company called Bourne & Koch bought the assets in 2002 and still supplies parts and manuals for J&L machines running in shops around the world. In Springfield itself, J&L Metrology survives as the last American manufacturer of optical comparators, still building Hartness and Porter's 1919 idea in digital form. In Windsor, the original 1846 brick armory stands as the American Precision Museum, a National Historic Landmark founded in 1966 by Edwin Battison, a Smithsonian curator of mechanical engineering who then ran the place himself for the next quarter century, where a first-model flat-turret lathe sits polished on the floor, close enough to touch, in the same building where interchangeable manufacturing came of age. And every summer on Breezy Hill, the Springfield telescope makers still gather at the little pink clubhouse called Stellafane. Machinist's descendants pointing homemade mirrors at the same Vermont sky, Hartness watched from his tunnel. Think back to that table in the Crystal Palace, 6 rifles stripped and rebuilt in front of an empire. The men of this company solved the hardest problem of the industrial age: how to make things precisely, repeatably, by the million. What no machine in their catalog could manufacture was good ownership. And in the end, the empire of precision was undone, not on the shop floor, but in boardrooms hundreds of miles from the Black River. The machines outlived the company that built them, and in workshops around the world, some of them are still running. If stories like this one are your kind of history, subscribe to Trade Archive right now and give the next video a watch. We will see you there.